the extremes that being the eastern end of the big landmass, I suppose that's what happened.
Yeah, that's kind of incredible that when you are that south that there is such an
Oh,
extent
terrible.
between
Right, terrible cold winter. Way worse than here. Everything
snow
gets
and
frozen
all
over.
that, yeah.
Snow, but the snow only comes in the milder parts of the winter. But everything gets frozen over completely. The frost would go down a couple of feet, pipes and stuff like that. You have to sink well into the ground or they get frozen. Um,
Welcome. My guest in tonight's lifestyle program is Father Jack Roche from Carriganema. Father Jack, who is a Colombian father in South Korea. Father, welcome to tonight's program.
Thank you, Michael.
Father, how long have you been in South Korea?
28 years this year.
And is it your only assignment since you were ordained?
No, I spent 2 years in England about 10 years ago.
Now, if we can go right back to your boyhood here in Carriganema, I believe you went to the local national school.
Right, Carriganema School.
And what year was that?
I went to Carriganema School, I'd say, the late 30s. I forget the year I went there for, but about 39, I would think.
Now, growing up in Ireland in the 30s, what can you remember about the locality around here?
Things were very tough at the time, really, because it's the Second World War I can remember. I can't remember before the Second World War too much. And during the Second World War, everything was rationed. There was no petrol, there were no private cars. We had no fruit, really, no imported fruit. And no white bread, it was all brown bread, home-baked bread. And that was the type of way we were living, really.
Now, how many members were in your family?
We had 10, 8 brothers and 2 sisters.
And from a farming?
From farming family.
Now, what's sort of your earliest memory of your childhood? What's the sort of first thing that you can remember that far back? What's the first thing that comes to mind?
I can remember going to the old school in Carriganema, and I can remember during play hour coming out and walking over through the village and thinking it was quite a big town, the village of Carriganema. And I can remember that day in the old school, and then I have no memory until I went back to the new school. But I can remember that one day walking through the village of Carriganema, and it seemed quite big to me because at that time we used to travel out from home as children.
Now, when you left Carriganema National School after completing your 5 or 6 years there, where did you go to secondary school?
I went to St. Coleman's for mine.
Now, what can you remember about St. Coleman's?
We were very young. I was very young at the time and very lonely there. It was a long ways from home. There were lonely days, but they were happy days. We were treated fairly well there, and a lot of good friends among the students, and the priests and professors were nice to us. So there were happy days, but there was that loneliness of being so far away from home.
Now, would you have come home from that boarding school very regularly, or were you just there for an entire term?
An entire term. We would come home for the Christmas, Easter, and summer vacations, and that was all.
Now, growing up as a young boy here in Carriganema, what were the Christmases like?
Christmases were great times, always, There were the candles and the Christmas dressings. We used to have a Christmas tree, the Christmas crib. We never saw Santa Claus, but he used to come sometime during the night. But there was always that celebration and happiness. And we used to have midnight mass either at that time. But the candles and the dressing of the candles and all this stuff, sweets and chocolates and the Christmas cake and the goose, we used to have those. And outside of Christmas, we'd never see chocolate or sweets. It was only at Christmas time really we used to see them at that time.
Now, while you were going to school and finishing your school days, obviously the Second World War was on. How big an influence was that, or did it have on even on your own childhood?
It had that big influence that we were always scared that it was going to come right to us. And we had stories of the war. and there used to be pictures and maps in the paper every day. And the adults around the place used to talk about it, that someday it might come this far. All road signposts and the name over the school in Carriganama, they were all blotted out for fear the war would come here and people could find their way around it. It was very security conscious even in Ireland at the time.
Now, how big a part did religion play in your life in the early days?
Oh, a big part. Prayer every day, and sometimes even got beaten to say my prayers when we were young. But prayer and religion were part and parcel of our lives at that time.
Now, when did you decide you wanted to join the priesthood?
From the earliest memory in my life, ever before I knew what a priest was or what a priest did, I wanted to be a priest. I suppose that's a vocation. And that was the very earliest memories I have, that I wanted to be a priest. The thing of becoming a foreign priest all happened in Carriganama School. I think it was 4th class. We were studying Irish history, and that section of Irish history where the Roman Empire had fallen, Christianity had died in Europe, and it was still very strong and alive in Ireland. And the missionaries from Ireland, Columkill to Iona, St. Columban to Bobbio in Sicily, northern Italy. This part of the Irish history and Master Lucy teaching this made an impression on me that I could never get rid of, really. That was the thing you should do with your life, was the impression I brought away from that section of Irish history. So the foreign missions stayed with me the whole way after that.
Now, Father Jack, which order did you join?
I joined the Columbans.
And where did you do your studying?
In Navan, in Dalgan Park in Navan.
Now, that was almost 5 or 6 years.
7 year course.
Now, would that have been a very expensive ordeal for your family? Because I would imagine educating a priest in the 1930s and 40s.
Actually, after the first year in the Columbans, it was up to the parents to donate what they felt like donating. So it was free and easy. After the first year in Dalgan, I became a member of the Columban Society. And as a member of the Columban Society, then it was donations was all they were looking for.
Right.
And there wasn't any school fee or anything after that.
So when you finished your period of training and were eventually ordained, did you go immediately to South Korea?
Right. After a vacation at home, I went to South Korea.
Was it your first choice?
No, it was very much down the line. I think my first choice was the Philippines. I always thought of the missionary as being somebody in a tropical climate, with the palm trees and the coconuts and the bananas and this stuff. And I was appointed to Korea. And my knowledge of Korea at the time was the Korean War, the cold winters. So I was very disappointed when I was appointed to Korea, but that lasted only a few days or a few weeks.
So when you got there, what did you find?
When I got there, it was November, and I found it cold and there was snow on the ground. But it wasn't too long till I found out that this was the country to be in. It was a very poor country at the time, and there wasn't a great number of Catholics. But soon after that, the country began to develop economically. People started to flock out to church with large numbers for baptism, and that's the way it's going ever since. It's improving economically, and the people are flocking to the church. Even small parishes would be baptizing about 200 adults a year in Korea yet.
Now, Korea is a country which we here in Ireland have been hearing quite a lot about over the last 12 months, for two reasons in particular. Obviously, the Olympic Games coming up a little bit later on in the year, but also for the sort of political upheaval that has been taking place in the last number of weeks. Firstly, the reports of trouble that we see in newspapers and whatnot, how real are they?
They were very real, and we hope that that it's all over. In 1960, the military took over the government in South Korea, and it was from then it began to develop economically, but at the same time politically it went backwards, and it was a military dictatorship ever since then until now. This year the president was to hand over power in an election, and last February, just about a year ago, he made an announcement that there would be no general election. He appointed his successor. Then the students took to the streets, and the people took to the streets, and especially May and June they became very violent, and the threat of the Olympics being called off in Seoul became very strong. And on the 29th of June, the man who was picked to be the successor to the military president made an announcement that they would change the constitution, they would have an open election, they would bring in democracy, freedom of speech, and they would free a lot of political prisoners. So then the country quietened, and everybody hoped that it would work out well and democracy would come in.
What size of a country is South Korea, Father Jack?
A little bigger than Ireland,
And what kind of a population?
40 million people.
Now, how strong is the American influence in South Korea?
It was very strong ever since the Korean War, and the Americans helped out a tremendous lot, and they poured in a lot of aid there. But the American influence is definitely still strong there, but it's very hard to see because the Korean people themselves have become so independent and so self-supporting that you don't notice the American influence. The Koreans on their own can stand on their own 2 feet now, I think.
Now, how big a role does the Catholic religion play in the life of the average Korean?
For the Catholics, it plays quite a big role, I suppose. For the ordinary folks, because we're only 5% of the population, the Catholic Church would not play a big role. But the Korean bishops, and especially Cardinal Kim in Seoul, stood up for democracy, for human rights, and because he was a cardinal of the church, he was the most influential person for reform in Korea on the opposition side, and everybody had to listen to him. And he became very popular with the young people, especially those who are not Catholics, people outside the church. They were always looking forward to him to be their spokesman and to be their man to get democracy and human rights.
Now, you mentioned there a few moments back that the country has basically transformed even since you went out there in 30 years ago. Why do you think the country is so developed, if I can use that word nowadays, economically and otherwise?
One of the big reasons was the Koreans decided to work, and from the top down, the opportunities were given, I think. I remember early after I went to Korea, the Koreans used to talk about the miracle of the Rhine, what happened in Germany after the Second World War. And they used to say, let's perform the miracle of the Han, which is the river flowing through Korea and through Seoul. And we used to think this was impossible, the miracle of the Han. And actually they got working and they performed the miracle of the Han. But very hard work. People who didn't have any money, people who were very poor, were prepared to work long hours just to get enough to eat and enough to have a comfortable house. So people coming from that sort of a livelihood, once the opportunity that was there for work, where they could get enough to eat and a comfortable house, the hours didn't make much difference to them at that stage. Now that they're getting more developed, they're looking for more regular hours and higher pay.
Now, your own role out in the as a missionary out in Seoul. What exactly is your role in that city?
Uh,
Or indeed the role of your mission house, the Columban Fathers?
our role still is a pastoral role. The majority of us are working in parishes, and we're working in parishes because there aren't enough Korean priests to work these parishes. But we have a whole uh, sphere of other activities. We have people with youth groups, we have people with labour groups, we have people in hospital chaplaincy, we have people in schools and in education. And around that whole field, we have some priests living and working in very poor areas, in what's being called nowadays the option for the poor. So it's all around that sort of field we work in.
Now, are there many missionary priests in the country at the moment?
At present, I think the number would be about 150, and that's from maybe about 60 from Ireland, all over Europe, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and some from Mexico.
Now, I believe you've been back home here a number of times in the past 30 years. Uh, what major changes have you seen in Ireland during your times coming back here?
First time home was the biggest change of all, I suppose. Television was in. The supermarkets were in. You know, the small family store seemed to be moving out. There were, you know, better cars, and people seemed to get around better. That was the first time home after being away 6 years. And then the next time home, things seemed to be fairly good. But in later trips, things seemed to be going down. The hope was disappearing. Young people leaving school, not much of a chance of getting employment. And even graduates from college were looking for jobs and had to emigrate. And right now it looks to be that sort of a way. The living conditions are great, everything is going great, but the hope for the youth, for the school leavers, seems to be very poor at present.
Father Jack, getting back to Korea again, are there many Irish people besides missionaries working in the country?
You know, at any time there might be 4 or 5 or 6. We meet some of them, and some of them would be there for a while before we meet them. But generally we meet in somewhere or other while they're there.
Now, your mission house is obviously thousands and thousands of miles away from Ireland, and indeed 9 hours of time difference. Would you have a lot of contact with home?
The contact we have with home is, you know, missionaries returning after a vacation at home. They would bring back the Irish papers and tell us what had happened in the last couple of weeks. But because we have so many people there, every couple of months there is somebody returning. And then people passing through will have the address of the Columban House, and they'll drop in. And, you know, there isn't a month go by but we'll meet somebody who's just back from Ireland or just from Ireland.
Now, would I don't know how this question will sound, but would the Koreans be very familiar with Ireland, or would they even know of its existence apart from the missionaries that are
Actually, they do. The Koreans have their education gives them great general knowledge, so they would have a lot of information about Ireland before we got there. But now the Koreans in our parish and the Koreans who know us, they would have a little bit more interest in Ireland. The same as the people here who know us in Korea. Anything they see or hear about Korea, they listen to it immediately. The Koreans in our parishes too. Anything they hear about Ireland, anything they know, they'll come to you immediately and ask you about it and talk about it. They have an interest in Ireland because they know somebody from Ireland.
How would you compare lifestyles in Korea and lifestyles here in Ireland from what you've seen in your number of trips home?
Well, you see, they're completely different. They're poles apart in ways. Their houses, their living, customs, everything. In Korea, you always take off your shoes at the door and walk in your stocking feet. And you don't sit on furniture like here. You sit on the floor. They sleep on the floor. And because they've no furniture in their rooms, small rooms look quite big when you walk into them. Their food is different. But the Koreans no more than here. They like a comfortable house. They like good food. Now they like good cars, colour television. They like stereo, and they're getting into video. Uh, we're much the same in lots of ways. But what they look for in their homes and what we look for can be much different.
Now, rural urban divide or spread of population. How roughly how does it work out?
The people have been leaving the country a lot and moving into the cities. They just leave in their droves and come into the city. But they seem to pick up jobs and pick up employment and get along fairly well. There are no great slum areas. There are some slum areas, but not great slum areas like you have in places in the Philippines and South America. A lot of the people who move in from the country, they have a contact in there somewhere, and they get some sort of a job, some sort of employment fairly soon. The slum areas are people who have been in there for some time, and they're trying to improve their lot as well. But the country population is getting smaller, the cities getting much bigger, and it causes a tremendous problem for traffic and for roads. Everybody gets into one little area, and then everything gets jammed up. Out the country, everything's dead free.
Now, speaking about the country, I know very well that the farmers here around Carriganimmer would be very annoyed with me if I didn't talk to you about farming in Korea,
Right.
what you know about it. Basically, what's the main type of farming that's carried on there?
Rice farming is the big one, and rice farming is so different to farming here. They plant the rice underwater, and it has to stay, the roots have to stay underwater. The plant comes above the water, of course, and it stays underwater, the plant and a bit of the stem, until the harvest time. And then just about that time it dries out, and they harvest the rice. But the land is differently here because the land will not, the water will not sink into the ground, seep into the ground. It will have to evaporate. Here, if you put water into a field, it will seep into the ground. But there, no, the nature of the soil holds the water. So rice is their big crop, and the big farming is rice.
And how developed is the agricultural economy there?
It's not as developed as the rest of the world, but they used to cut, and some of them are still cutting the rice with the sickle, the old hook, by hand. But they've little combined harvesters, and they're beautiful little things. Real small, and they get around the rice paddy, and they trash and cut and trash and all in the one day. They're beautiful little things, but not big. They're self-propelled little machines.
Now, Father, North Korea has been mentioned quite frequently in the last few months because, number one, it obviously is being ruled by a military dictatorship. How much do you know about North Korea? Sort of what influence has the North Korean problem on the South Korean way of life?
Actually, we know very little about North Korea, and I think a lot of the world say they know very little about North Korea. But because we're in South Korea, that's diametrically opposed to the regime in North Korea, we're not sure the information they're giving us, whether it's correct or whether it's not. But we look to the rest of the world to see what they say. And the news isn't too good. Economically, they're in bad shape. They're not making any great headway.
Now, Seoul, the city that you're in, of course, will be the centre of attraction for millions around the world in mid-September to early October because of the Olympic Games. What can people expect when they turn on their television screens in October, or in September, apart from the sporting side of it? Can we get any sort of a glimpse of Seoul lifestyles?
Oh, I'm sure you will. And the government in South Korea and the people in Seoul want to show the world what Seoul and what South Korea is like. They'll show you all the best parts of it. They won't show you the not so good part. But they will show you as much as they can of the progress Korea has made and of the way people are actually living in Seoul. And they want to show that to the world.
And do you think yourself that Seoul will be a brilliant host for the Olympics?
I think so. All the Koreans want to do this as best they can. The facilities in Seoul are the best yet of any Olympics. Of course, they're the latest. The preparations they have made are the best yet of all the Olympics, but they have learned from the other Olympic venues. They're doing everything they can to make it a real success. And they have slogans written up on walls and high buildings, banners all over the place. And translated into English, what they say is September 88, Korea to the world, and the world to Korea. They really wanted to make it a big international event to let the whole world see what Korea is like.
Father, before we bring this interview to a conclusion, can I just talk for a moment about vocations? Now, I would suspect myself that the number of young men and indeed young women wanting to go into religion today is decreasing. Any comments to make on that?
It's decreasing, and we feel a little sad about it. But however, God's ways aren't our ways. There's a feeling of insecurity, I think, about the religious life. And some of that has been brought on by various comments that have been made even by people in religious life. But from my own experience, that's unfounded. It's a grand way of life. And it's a very happy way of life. And the older I get and the longer I'm in the priesthood or the religious life, the more I'm seeing that it's a very useful and a very fruitful sort of it I like to be in. But then, that's my comment on it. Young people figure that it's insecure and it's unsure, and that's the problem they have. How we could get rid of that problem, I don't know.
Why do you think that Irish people have had such an influence on religion worldwide?
It's amazing, and we often try to wonder why. Did God ordain it so that ever since the first days of Christianity in Ireland, the Irish priests, brothers and sisters, just travelled all over the world, and they've been doing it right up to the present day. Now there is a slack off in that foreign apostolate, and some other country will probably take up the slack at this stage. And the Koreans like to say they are the next, they will take up the slack. And it might happen that way. But it's hard to explain why it was the Irish who travelled around the world up to now.
Now, I know that talking to you before we started this, that without the help you got from your family here, and indeed the help you got from the local community and the moral support, you would not be where you are today.
That's quite true. That's quite true. It's tremendously encouraging to hear from people at home while you're out in the mission. And every time you come home, the tremendous moral support, the prayers that are being said for you, the friendliness, and for some reason or other, people tell you you're doing what they would like you to do. It gives great courage, and it's beautiful. And it's all around Carriganema, and not alone Carriganema, but you travel the parishes all around this part of the country. And I don't know, they give tremendous encouragement to the foreign missions. They're tremendous people.
From talking to you for the last 20 minutes or so, I gather that you are totally happy in Korea, and that regretfully we won't be expecting to see you back here in Ireland we will be expecting to see you back on visits, but not as a pastor for many a long day.
Yes, I'm very happy in Korea, really. It's a beautiful country. And the type of work is that much different. I mightn't be able to work in Ireland now. after a few months I'd possibly get around to it. But it's different. And every missionary who has been to Korea leaves and comes back. He gets itchy feet, even though he's an old man. He gets itchy feet to go back to Korea again. There is some sort of tremendous draw in getting people back to Korea.
Now, Father Jack, finally, your old school here in Carriganema is this year celebrating its Golden Jubilee. Any message for the local people, or indeed for the local school children attending that school today?
Keep up the old spirit that has existed in Carriganema as long as I've known it. When we were children going to school, we got along very well together. And I see the children in school today. They're great friends and they get along great. And they're great hope for the future of Carriganema from what we see here. Respect for their parents and their teachers. And I think Carriganema is still going to be, for all of us, the centre of the world. And it's going to stay that way.
Father Jack Roche, my guest in this week's Lifestyle program, thank you, and may I wish you continued success in your missionary work in South Korea.
Thank you, Michael.